I used to think silence was safety. In our house, silence meant no arguments, no punishments, no consequences. It meant my father was satisfied for now. The cameras stayed still, their tiny red lights blinking like quiet warnings. The guards remained stationed at their posts, expressionless and unmoving like part of the walls themselves. And I stayed exactly where I was supposed to be. Perfect, obedient, invisible. The mansion was beautiful in the way a museum is beautiful. Polished marble floors that reflected every step, towering glass windows that let in too much light yet never enough warmth, and long corridors lined with expensive art that no one ever stopped to admire. It wasn't a home. It was a display, and I was just another piece inside it. Elara Voss, daughter of a man everyone feared, a name that opened doors for others but quietly locked every single one for me. I learned early on that freedom was not something I was meant to have. Even my thoughts felt monitored sometimes, like if I dared to want too much, someone somewhere would know and take even that away. There were rules unspoken but understood. Don't question. Don't resist. Don't feel too much, because feeling led to mistakes and mistakes led to consequences. I had made that error once, years ago, when I was younger and still naive enough to believe I could ask for something as simple as a friend. Not a curated companion chosen by my father's people, not a smiling stranger trained to agree with everything I said, but a real friend. Someone unpredictable. Someone honest. I never asked again after that. Since then, I learned to play my role perfectly. I smiled when expected, spoke when spoken to, and kept the rest of myself locked away where no one could reach it. The staff moved around me like I was something fragile, something to be preserved rather than understood. Conversations were brief and carefully measured. Even laughter felt rehearsed, like a performance everyone had memorized except me. Sometimes I would stand by the window in the east wing, staring out at the gates far beyond the gardens, wondering what it would feel like to walk past them without permission, without fear. I imagined noise, messy, chaotic, uncontrollable noise, and wondered what it would be like to live in it instead of this suffocating quiet. But imagination was dangerous too. It made the reality harder to accept, so I stopped allowing myself to dream. I became what they needed me to be: quiet, controlled, untouchable. And yet, even in that silence, there was always a lingering emptiness, a hollow ache that never quite went away. It lived in the spaces between seconds, in the pauses between conversations, in the stillness of nights that stretched too long. I told myself it didn't matter, that this was enough, that I was enough. But deep down, in a place I tried very hard to ignore, I knew the truth. I wasn't living. I was waiting. Waiting for something to change. Waiting for something to break. I just didn't know yet that the thing that would break first was me. His name was Kael Ardent. I learned it the way I learned everything in that house, quietly, indirectly, like it wasn't meant for me to truly hold on to. Two guards spoke in low voices near the west corridor, unaware that I had paused just out of sight. "New assignment," one of them said. "Ardent." The name lingered in my mind long after their footsteps faded. It sounded sharp, deliberate, dangerous. When I finally saw him up close, standing at the far end of the hall as if he had always belonged there, I understood immediately that he was nothing like the others. Most of the guards carried a kind of visible tension, like they were always waiting for something to go wrong. Their eyes moved constantly, scanning doors, windows, shadows. Kael didn't do that. He stood still, almost unnaturally so, his posture relaxed but not careless. His presence wasn't loud or imposing. It was quiet, controlled. Like he didn't need to prove anything because he already knew exactly what he was capable of. When our eyes met for the first time, I felt something shift in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. I was used to fear. It wasn't curiosity either, not entirely. It was something sharper, something that made it hard to look away even when I knew I should. Most people, when they looked at me, carried expectation in their gaze. They saw a role before they saw a person. The obedient daughter. The fragile girl, the responsibility. Kael didn't look at me like that. There was no softness in his expression, no forced politeness, no trace of obligation. He studied me openly as if I were a question he intended to solve. It should have unsettled me. It did in a way. But it also did something worse. It made me feel seen. Not the version of me I showed everyone else, but something underneath it, something I had spent years trying to hide. I found myself pausing more often when I knew he was nearby, lingering just long enough to catch a glimpse of him standing at his post or walking the perimeter with measured steps. He didn't speak unless necessary, and even then his words were brief, precise. There was no effort to impress, no attempt to connect. And yet somehow that distance drew me in more than any forced kindness ever had. The others treated me like something delicate, something to be protected from the world. Kael didn't. He treated me like I already understood it. Days passed and I became aware of something else. He wasn't watching everything. He was watching me. Not constantly, not in the suffocating way I was used to, but in moments. Quiet, deliberate moments where his attention would settle on me, steady and unflinching, before shifting away again like nothing had happened. It made my chest tighten in ways I didn't understand. I told myself it meant nothing, that he was just doing his job, that I was imagining something that wasn't there. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger, threading itself through my thoughts until I found myself anticipating his presence without meaning to. For the first time in a long time, someone in that house wasn't pretending, and that, more than anything else, made him dangerous. It started with small things, so small I almost convinced myself they meant nothing. In a place like this, you learn not to read into kindness because most of it is manufactured, scripted into existence by people who are paid to make your life feel less like a cage. But this felt different. Subtle, unannounced, unclaimed. The first time I noticed it, it was a door, one that was always locked, left slightly open. Just enough for me to pause, to hesitate, to wonder if it was a mistake. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the narrow gap as if it might disappear if I blinked. No guard corrected it. No voice called out to stop me, and when I glanced down the corridor, I saw him. Kael stood at a distance, his posture still, his gaze not quite on me but not entirely elsewhere either. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But something about the moment felt intentional, like a silent permission that no one else would have ever given me. I didn't step through the door that day. I wasn't brave enough yet, but the thought lingered long after I walked away. Then there was the book. I hadn't mentioned it recently, not to anyone who would have cared enough to remember. It was something I had said months ago, in passing, during one of those hollow conversations with a carefully selected companion who had nodded too eagerly at everything I said. I remember thinking at the time that no one had really been listening. And yet there it was, placed neatly on the small table beside my usual seat in the lounge. No note, no explanation, just the exact novel I had once admitted I wanted to read. I picked it up slowly, my fingers brushing over the cover as a strange warmth settled in my chest. Confusion followed quickly after. People didn't do things like this for me, not without making sure I knew who to thank, not without turning it into something I owed. But this felt anonymous. Or maybe it was. When I looked up, I found him again, standing near the far wall, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge the book, didn't even glance in my direction this time, but I knew. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. And that unsettled me more than it should have. It didn't stop there. Little moments began to stack on top of each other, too deliberate to ignore, too quiet to confront. A chair pulled out before I reached it, though no one stood close enough to have done it. A path cleared in the garden before I arrived, as if someone had anticipated exactly where I would want to walk. And then, one evening, when exhaustion weighed heavier than usual and my thoughts refused to settle, his voice broke through the silence for the first time without being prompted. "You should rest." That was all he said. No softness. No concern laced in his tone, just a simple statement delivered as if it were fact. I turned toward him, surprised by the sound of his voice more than the words themselves. "I'm fine," I replied automatically, the way I always did. But he didn't nod, didn't accept it like everyone else would have. He just looked at me, really looked this time, and something in that gaze made it hard to hold onto the lie. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just left. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I slept that night without the usual restlessness clawing at me. That was when I realized the truth I had been trying to avoid. Kael wasn't trying to get close to me. He wasn't forcing anything, wasn't asking for trust or offering comfort in the ways others had before. He simply existed in the spaces around me, quiet and steady, until his presence became something I noticed even in his absence. And slowly, without meaning to, I began to look for him. Not because I trusted him, not yet, but because I wanted to. And that, more than anything else, felt like the first real crack in the life I had so carefully learned to survive. "I can take you outside." The words should have meant nothing. In this house, offers didn't exist, only instructions, permissions, and carefully disguised commands. And yet when Kael said it, standing a few steps behind me with that same quiet steadiness he always carried, it didn't feel like any of those things. It felt different. I turned to look at him, searching his expression for the catch I was certain had to be there. There was always a catch, but his face revealed nothing. No expectation. No pressure, just a simple statement as if the choice truly belonged to me. Choice. The concept felt foreign, almost fragile, like something that might disappear if I reached for it too quickly. "I'm allowed," I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out softer than I intended. It was a reflex, one I had learned long ago, to measure every possibility against what I was permitted to do. Kael's gaze didn't waver. "You're with me," he said, as if that explained everything. As if his presence alone was enough to make it possible. I hesitated, my thoughts tangling with years of conditioning that told me this wasn't how things worked. Nothing in my life had ever been this simple, but something in his tone, in the quiet certainty of it, made it harder to refuse. So I nodded. The walk to the gardens felt longer than usual, each step carrying a strange weight of anticipation and unease. I expected someone to stop us, to question it, to remind me of the boundaries I had never been allowed to cross. But no one did. The guards we passed stepped aside without a word. Doors opened. Paths cleared. It was as if the world had shifted slightly, bending just enough to let me through. The air outside felt different the moment we stepped beyond the threshold. Lighter, cooler, real in a way that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd been allowed out here without a dozen watchful eyes pressing in on me from every direction. The gardens stretched out in quiet elegance, perfectly maintained, but somehow less suffocating than the walls inside. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the breeze brush against my skin, grounding myself in something that didn't feel controlled or curated. "Where do you want to go?" Kael asked. The question startled me more than anything else had. No one had ever asked me that before, not like this. Not without already knowing or deciding the answer. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure. What did I want? The thought felt unfamiliar, almost overwhelming. After a moment, I pointed toward a narrow path lined with hedges, one I had only ever seen from a distance. "There," I said quietly. He didn't question it, didn't redirect me. He simply stepped aside, giving me space to move ahead first. And I did. Each step felt tentative at first, like I was waiting for the illusion to break, for someone to call me back. But it didn't happen. The further we walked, the more something inside me began to loosen, unraveling in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I found myself noticing small things, the sound of gravel beneath my shoes, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, the faint scent of flowers carried on the wind. Details I had never paid attention to before because I had never been allowed to experience them freely. Kael remained a quiet presence behind me, never too close, never too far. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt the silence that had settled between us. But it wasn't the same silence I was used to. This one didn't feel heavy. It didn't press down on me or demand anything in return. It simply existed, open and unguarded. And for the first time in years, I felt something dangerously close to freedom. It was fleeting, fragile, and probably not real, but it was enough to make my chest ache with something I couldn't quite name. I didn't realize then that every step I took, every path I chose, had already been anticipated. That even this moment, this illusion of control, was something carefully given to me. All I knew was how it felt, and how quickly I was beginning to crave it. I don't remember when it changed. There wasn't a single moment I could point to, no clear line between before and after. It happened quietly, like everything else in that house, slipping into place so seamlessly I didn't notice until it was already too late to take back. One day, Kael was simply there, a distant presence I had grown used to. And the next day, he was the person I searched for without thinking. It started with awareness. I began to notice the exact times he appeared in certain hallways, the way his footsteps were almost soundless against the marble floors, the subtle shift in the air that seemed to follow him. I learned the rhythm of his presence before I ever acknowledged what it meant. And once I did, it settled into something deeper, something I couldn't ignore. I found reasons to linger in places where I knew he would be stationed. The library became less about the books and more about the quiet certainty that he would be somewhere nearby, standing just out of reach but not entirely out of sight. The gardens, once a rare privilege, turned into a routine I began to look forward to, not because of the open space, but because he was always there with me. We still didn't speak much. That was what made it different from anything I had known before. There were no forced conversations, no rehearsed exchanges filled with empty politeness. When Kael spoke, it was because he had something to say, not because silence needed to be filled. And when he didn't speak, it never felt uncomfortable. It felt understood. I started telling him things without realizing it. Small things at first, observations, passing thoughts, fragments of myself I had never shared with anyone else. He never interrupted, never reacted in ways that made me feel exposed. He just listened, fully, intently, like every word mattered, and that alone was enough to keep me talking. It didn't take long before those small things turned into something more. I told him about the loneliness I had stopped trying to name, about the invisible weight of expectations I carried every day, about the quiet resentment I felt toward a life I had never chosen. I expected him to dismiss it or worse, to report it, but he didn't. He held onto my words without judgment, without consequence. And in doing so, he gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing: space. I began to trust him. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to lower the walls I had spent years building. Enough to let him see parts of me no one else ever had. It felt natural, easy, safe. And that should have been my first warning, because nothing in my life had ever been those things without a reason behind it. But I didn't question it. I didn't want to. Wanting him there became as instinctive as breathing. I noticed when he was gone, felt the absence like something tangible, something that left the world slightly off balance. And when he returned, that quiet steadiness came back with him, grounding me in ways I didn't understand but didn't question. I stopped looking for approval from others, stopped trying to fit into the version of myself that had been created for me. Because with Kael, I didn't have to be that person. I could just be me, and that was more dangerous than anything else. Because without realizing it, I had given him everything: my trust, my thoughts, my vulnerabilities, my heart. I didn't fall for him in a dramatic, undeniable way. There was no sudden realization, no moment where everything shifted all at once. It was slower than that, deeper. A quiet unraveling that left me exposed in ways I had never been before. And by the time I understood what was happening, it wasn't something I could stop. I had already become his. Not because he asked, not because he forced it, but because, for the first time in my life, I had chosen someone, and I had chosen him. There were moments I couldn't explain, small and fleeting, like shadows that moved just at the edge of my vision before disappearing when I tried to focus on them. At first, I told myself they were nothing. In a place like this, it was easier not to question things too closely. Easier to accept what was in front of me rather than risk uncovering something I wasn't meant to see. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew sharper, more persistent, settling somewhere deep in my chest where it was impossible to ignore for long. It started with people. Faces I had grown used to seeing, guards who had been stationed in the same places for months, staff members who followed the same routines day after day, began to disappear. Not all at once, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but gradually, like pieces being moved on a board I couldn't fully see. When I asked about it, the answers came quickly, too quickly. Reassignments, routine changes, nothing unusual. And yet, something about the way those explanations were delivered felt rehearsed, as if they had been prepared in advance. I noticed how often Kael was present when those changes happened, how his timing always seemed precise, his positioning never accidental. He was there when a conversation ended abruptly, the moment he stepped into the room, the air shifting as if something unspoken had just been cut off. He was there when a door that had always been locked suddenly opened, only to be secured again later without explanation. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, that I was connecting things that weren't meant to be connected. But doubt has a way of growing once it's been planted, threading itself through every moment until it becomes impossible to separate truth from assumption. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying everything in my mind, trying to piece together patterns that didn't quite fit. And every time, my thoughts circled back to him. Kael, the one constant in a world that suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. The one person who always seemed to know exactly what to say, exactly how to steady me when something felt off. "You're overthinking it," he told me once, his voice low, even, grounding. I wanted to believe him. I did believe him, at least for a while, because trusting him was easier than facing the alternative. If I questioned him, I would have to question everything, and I wasn't ready for that. So I let his words settle over me, smoothing out the edges of my doubt until they felt manageable again, until the unease faded just enough for me to ignore it. But the cracks were still there. I saw them in the way certain hallways felt emptier than they used to, in the way conversations seemed shorter, more guarded, as if something invisible was shaping them. I felt them in the way my world had slowly narrowed without me realizing it, how the people around me had become fewer, how the space I moved through had become quieter, more contained. And through it all, Kael remained, steady, unchanging, the only thing that still made sense. I began to rely on that steadiness more than I should have. When something felt wrong, I looked to him. When doubt crept in, I waited for him to dismiss it. And every time he did, calmly, effortlessly. Like he knew exactly what I needed to hear. That should have frightened me. The way he could pull me back from the edge of uncertainty so easily, the way his presence alone could quiet the questions forming in my mind. But it didn't. It comforted me. Because believing in him meant I didn't have to believe in anything else. I didn't have to see the pieces moving around me or wonder who was moving them. I didn't have to confront the possibility that my reality wasn't as stable as I thought it was. All I had to do was trust him. And I did. Even as something deep inside me whispered that I shouldn't. Even as the world around me continued to shift in ways I couldn't fully understand. I chose him anyway. Because holding on to that trust felt easier than letting everything fall apart. It didn't happen the way I imagined something like that would. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal where everything shattered at once. The truth didn't arrive like a storm. It seeped in quietly, slipping through the cracks I had spent so long trying to ignore until it became impossible to hold everything together. It started with a single word. I hadn't been meant to hear it, I think. Kael was speaking to someone just out of sight, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the careful neutrality he used around me. I couldn't make out most of the conversation, only fragments carried through the narrow gap of a half-closed door. Routine, timing, adjustment, words that could have meant anything on their own. Words I might have dismissed entirely if not for the way he said them. Precise, calculated, like he was discussing something structured, something planned. And then there was the word that didn't belong. Subject. It took me a second to process it, to understand why it felt wrong. Subject, not person, not name, not me, something colder, something distant. I should have walked away. I should have convinced myself I misunderstood, that it wasn't what it sounded like. But I didn't. I stayed, my breath held, my pulse loud in my ears as I listened for something, anything, that would explain it away. It never came. When the conversation ended and I heard footsteps approaching, I moved before I could be seen, slipping down the corridor with a sense of urgency I couldn't quite control. My mind raced, trying to catch up with what I had just heard, trying to reshape it into something that made sense. Subject. The word repeated over and over, each time hitting harder than the last. It didn't fit with the version of Kael I knew, the one who listened, the one who understood. The one who had become the only real thing in my life. It didn't fit. It couldn't fit. And yet, once the doubt had taken hold, everything else began to unravel with it. The door that had been left open that day, the book that had appeared without explanation. The carefully timed moments, the way he always seemed to know exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't instinct. It was intention. Design. My chest tightened as the realization settled in, heavy and suffocating. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I was studied. Every conversation we had, every piece of myself I had handed over so freely, it hadn't been connection. It had been strategy. I thought back to the times he reassured me, the way he dismissed my doubts so easily, how he guided me away from questions before they could fully form. It wasn't comfort. It was control. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became, each memory shifting into something unrecognizable. Twisted. Wrong. I felt it then, something breaking deep inside me, something fragile and essential that I didn't know how to hold on to anymore. I had trusted him. Not just in the small, cautious way I trusted others, but fully, completely, in a way I had never allowed myself before. And he had known that. He had used it. I didn't realize I was shaking until I reached my room and closed the door behind me, the quiet click echoing louder than it should have. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the surface, grounding myself in something solid, something real. But even that felt uncertain now, because if Kael wasn't what I thought he was, then what was? And more importantly, what did that make me? The answer came before I could stop it. Not a person, not to him. A subject, something to be observed. Manipulated, broken. The thought hollowed me out, leaving behind a cold, empty space where something warm had once existed. And for the first time since he had entered my life, I didn't feel safe when I thought of him. I felt exposed. Like everything I was had already been seen, already been taken apart piece by piece. And the worst part wasn't the realization itself. It was the quiet, unbearable truth that followed it. Even now, even as everything inside me told me to pull away, to run, to protect what little I had left, some part of me still wanted to believe he wasn't lying. That the man I thought I knew was still there somewhere beneath it all. That not everything had been fake. But hope, I was starting to understand, could be just as dangerous as trust. And I had already given him both. Was any of it real? The question left my lips before I could stop it, fragile and unsteady in a way that made it feel like it might break apart before it even reached him. I hadn't planned to confront him, hadn't rehearsed what I would say or how I would hold myself together when the moment finally came. But the truth had a way of forcing itself into the open, of demanding to be acknowledged no matter how much you wished it would stay buried. Kael stood a few steps away from me, his posture as composed as ever, his expression carefully neutral. For a brief, irrational second, I searched his face for the same quiet familiarity I had once found comfort in. But it was gone. Or maybe it had never been there to begin with. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest until it became hard to breathe. He didn't answer me right away. And that hesitation, so small, so fleeting, felt like something sharp driving straight through me. Because if the answer had been simple, if there had been anything real to hold on to, he wouldn't have needed time to think. He would have said it immediately, without doubt, without pause. "Elara," he said finally, my name low and steady in a way that once would have calmed me. Now it only made everything worse. It sounded the same, but it didn't feel the same. Not anymore. "Don't," I cut in, my voice breaking despite my effort to keep it steady. "Don't say my name like that. Like it meant something, like I meant something. Because I didn't know if I did. Not to him, not in the way I had believed." My hands curled slightly at my sides, nails pressing into my palms as if I could anchor myself to the sensation, keep myself from unraveling completely. "Just answer me," I whispered, the words quieter now but no less desperate. "Was any of it real?" Another pause. Longer this time, longer than it should have been. And in that silence, I felt everything begin to collapse piece by piece until there was nothing left to hold on to. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "It wasn't supposed to be." The words hit harder than anything else he could have said, not because they were cruel, but because they weren't a denial. They weren't reassurance. They weren't the lie I had been hopping for. They were something worse. The truth, stripped down to its simplest, most devastating form. I let out a quiet, unsteady breath, my vision blurring slightly as I struggled to process what that meant. Not supposed to be. That implied something had changed. That somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. But it didn't erase what he had done. It didn't undo the manipulation, the careful planning, the way he had taken every part of me and turned it into something he could use. "So it was all planned," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. "Everything, the conversations, the things you said, the way you—" I couldn't finish the sentence, the weight of it too much to put into words. "The way you made me feel like I mattered." His gaze shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface before it disappeared just as quickly. "Yes." The single word was quiet, but it shattered whatever fragile hope I had been clinging to. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him, as if I needed the motion to make it real, to make myself accept it, because denial wasn't an option anymore. "I trusted you," I said, the words barely more than a breath. It felt strange to say it out loud, to reduce everything I had felt into something so simple, so easily broken. "I know." There was something in his voice then, something almost human. Regret. Guilt. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. Because whatever it was, it didn't change anything. It didn't fix what had already been done. I let out a soft, humorless laugh, the sound foreign even to my own ears. "Do you?" I asked, looking at him properly for the first time since the conversation began. "Do you know what it's like to have nothing real in your life, and then suddenly think you found something that is?" My chest tightened as I spoke, each word pulling something raw and exposed to the surface. "To believe in it so completely that you don't even question it." He didn't answer. He didn't need to, because this time the silence wasn't hesitation. It was understanding, and somehow that hurt even more. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold his gaze even as everything inside me screamed to look away. "You made me feel like I had a choice," I continued, my voice quieter now but steadier than before. "Like I was more than just something to be controlled." My throat tightened around the last words, but I pushed through it. "And all of it was just part of the plan." Another pause, another silence. But this one felt different. He wasn't avoiding the answer. He was giving it to me without words. Yes, everything had been part of the plan. I felt something inside me finally give way, the last fragile thread holding everything together snapping under the weight of it. And yet, even as the truth settled in, cold and unrelenting, there was something else there too. Something I hated myself for. Because despite everything he had just admitted, despite everything I now knew, I still couldn't bring myself to stop caring. The realization was as painful as the betrayal itself, maybe even more. Because it meant that even now, even when I understood exactly what he had done, my heart hadn't caught up with my mind. It still recognized him as something safe, something important, something mine. And that was the cruelest part of all. Because loving him now didn't feel like comfort. It felt like weakness, like the final piece of myself he had taken without even needing to try. I knew they were coming before I ever saw them. The air shifted first, subtle but unmistakable, like the house itself was holding its breath. It was the same feeling I had learned to recognize over the years, something imminent, something controlled but dangerous, something that meant I was no longer safe in the illusion I had been allowed to live in. Footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor outside my room, heavier than usual, more deliberate. Not the quiet, routine movement of guards stationed to observe, but something purposeful, final. I stood in the center of the room, my body tense, my thoughts strangely calm despite the storm building inside me. This was the end of something. I didn't know exactly what yet, but I could feel it. The door opened without warning. No knock, no announcement. Just the sharp, decisive sound of the lock disengaging followed by the slow swing of polished wood. 3 men stepped inside, their expressions unreadable, their presence immediately suffocating. They weren't familiar faces, not part of the usual rotation. That alone told me everything I needed to know. My gaze flicked past them instinctively, searching for someone else even though I told myself not to, even though I knew I shouldn't. And then I saw him. Kael stood just beyond them, partially obscured, his posture rigid in a way I had never seen before. For a brief, irrational second, relief surged through me. Because if he was here, then maybe something could still be stopped. Maybe this wasn't what I thought it was. But then one of the men stepped closer, and that fragile hope faltered. "It's time," he said, his voice flat, almost bored, as if this was nothing more than a routine task. Time. The word echoed in my mind, heavy with meaning I didn't want to fully understand. I didn't move. Couldn't. My gaze remained fixed on Kael, searching his face for something, anything. That would tell me I was wrong, that this wasn't happening the way it looked like it was. "Kael," I said, his name leaving my lips softer than I intended, fragile in a way I hated. He didn't answer immediately, didn't step forward, didn't stop them. The hesitation was brief, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Enough to make everything inside me go cold. The men reached for me then, their hands firm, unyielding. I flinched instinctively, the movement sharp and uncontrolled, but they didn't loosen their grip. Panic surged, quick and suffocating, clawing its way up my chest as reality finally caught up with me. This was it. This was what he had been preparing me for all along. Every moment, every conversation, every carefully placed piece of trust, it had all led to this. I turned back to him, desperation breaking through the numbness. "You said," my voice faltered, the words catching in my throat because I didn't even know what I was trying to hold onto anymore. "You said you would protect me. You said I was safe." None of it mattered now, but before I could finish, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a tightening in his posture, and then movement, fast, precise, violent. Kael stepped forward, his hand catching the arm of the man closest to me before I even had time to react. The motion was controlled but forceful, twisting just enough to break the man's grip. Everything happened in fragments after that, too quick for my mind to fully process. A strike, a struggle, the sharp sound of something hitting the floor. The other men moved in response, but Kael was already ahead of them. His movements efficient, calculated in a way that made it clear this wasn't hesitation anymore. This was a decision. He wasn't holding back, not for them, not for the mission. My breath caught as I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the reality of what I was seeing sank in. He was fighting them, not with them. For me. The realization hit harder than I expected, colliding with everything I had just learned, everything I had tried to accept. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit. Because if this had all been part of his plan, then why the thought cut off as one of the men lunged forward again, only to be stopped just as quickly, Kael's movements sharp and unrelenting. There was no hesitation left in him now. No distance. No careful control. Just something raw, something desperate, something that felt dangerously close to human. The room fell quiet as quickly as it had descended into chaos, the aftermath settling heavily around us. My ears rang, my pulse loud and uneven as I tried to steady myself to understand what had just happened. The men were no longer a threat, and Kael stood between me and the door, his chest rising and falling slightly, his gaze fixed on me in a way I had never seen before. Not calculated, not distant, something else, something I didn't know how to name. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice lower now, rougher, like it had been stripped of something essential. I stared at him, the question barely registering through the storm of emotions crashing through me. Hurt. The word felt almost meaningless compared to everything else. "Why?" I asked instead, my voice unsteady despite my effort to keep it controlled. It was the only question that mattered. Why now? Why after everything? He didn't answer right away. And this time, the silence didn't feel like hesitation. It felt like truth waiting to be acknowledged. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was no distance left in it. "Because I can't let them take you." The words settled between us, heavy and undeniable. Not I won't. Not I shouldn't. I can't. And somehow that made it worse, because it meant this wasn't strategy. It wasn't part of the plan. It was something else entirely. Something that came too late to undo what had already been done. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold his gaze even as everything inside me twisted painfully. "You were going to let them," I said, the truth cutting through the moment before it could become something else. His expression shifted, just slightly, something dark flickering beneath the surface. "I was," he admitted. The honesty hit harder than any lie could have. I nodded slowly, the motion automatic, grounding me in something solid even as everything else felt like it was slipping away. "Then don't act like this changes anything," I said, my voice quieter now but steadier than before. Because it didn't. It couldn't, not after everything. Not after the way he had broken me long before this moment. He didn't argue, didn't try to justify it. He just stood there, the space between us filled with everything we couldn't fix. And for the first time since he had entered my life, I understood something with absolute clarity. He had chosen me, but he had done it too late. I didn't leave in anger. There were no raised voices, no shattered glass, no final words meant to wound or linger. It would have been easier if there had been. Easier to hold on to something sharp and clean, something I could point to and say this is why I'm walking away. But the truth was quieter than that. Softer. Infinitely more painful. I left because staying would have destroyed what little of me was still intact. The world outside the walls I had known all my life didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt overwhelming. Too loud, too unpredictable, too real. There were no carefully controlled conversations here, no invisible boundaries guiding every step. People spoke without permission, laughed without restraint, lived without constantly looking over their shoulders. It should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of a storm without knowing how to move. For a long time, I didn't. I drifted more than I lived, trying to piece together a version of myself that existed without him, without the life I had always known. It was harder than I expected, because no matter how much I tried to rebuild, there were parts of me that still carried him. His voice, his presence, the way he had once made everything feel steady even when it was. I hated that. Hated how deeply he had embedded himself into my thoughts, into the quiet spaces I couldn't escape. But healing, I learned, wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about learning how to exist alongside it without letting it define me. Slowly, things began to shift. I started making choices, small ones at first, insignificant to anyone else but monumental to me. What to eat, where to go, who to speak to. Each decision felt like reclaiming a piece of something I had never truly owned before. It was terrifying and freeing and exhausting, but it was mine. Time passed in a way I hadn't experienced before, unstructured and unmonitored. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and somewhere along the way, the sharp edge of everything that had happened began to dull. Not disappear, not fade into nothing, but soften just enough that it didn't consume me entirely. I became someone different. Stronger, in ways I hadn't expected. Not because I had forgotten what he did, but because I had survived it. And then, one day, I saw him again. It wasn't planned. There was no dramatic lead-up, no sense of inevitability building toward the moment. I was simply walking down a quiet street, my thoughts elsewhere, when something familiar pulled my attention back. I looked up, and there he was. Kael stood across from me, just far enough that I could have turned away without acknowledging him. For a second, neither of us moved. The world around us continued as if nothing had changed, people passing by without noticing the weight of what existed in that single moment. He looked different. Not in a way I could immediately define, but enough that I felt it. The sharp edges of him had softened, the distance he once carried replaced by something quieter, something almost uncertain. He didn't step forward, didn't speak, didn't reach for me the way he might have before. He just stood there, his gaze steady but patient, like he understood that whatever happened next wasn't something he could control. And for the first time since I had known him, he was right. The choice wasn't his. It was mine. I could have walked away. Part of me wanted to. It would have been easier, safer, cleaner. To leave him standing there with everything unsaid, to close that chapter of my life without reopening the wounds that had taken so long to heal. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger, that had learned how to stand on its own, understood something different. Running wouldn't change what had happened. Avoiding him wouldn't erase the connection we had once shared, no matter how broken it had been. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, grounding myself in the person I had become. I wasn't the girl he had met in that glass cage anymore. I wasn't the girl who had needed him to feel whole. I was someone else now. Someone who could choose without fear, so I stepped forward. Each step felt deliberate, controlled, mine. The distance between us closed gradually, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. When I finally stopped in front of him, I held his gaze without hesitation, without uncertainty. He didn't speak, didn't apologize, didn't try to explain. And I realized then that he understood something important, that words wouldn't fix this. That whatever existed between us now wasn't something that could be undone or rewritten. It could only be accepted. "You didn't come looking for me," I said finally, my voice calm, steady in a way it had never been before. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. His expression shifted slightly, something almost like restraint flickering beneath the surface. "You needed space," he replied. Simple, honest, no excuses. I studied him for a moment, searching for the man I had once known, the one who had broken me, the one who had also, in some complicated, painful way, chosen me in the end. He was still there, but he wasn't the same. Neither of us were. Silence settled between us again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. It was open, waiting. I felt it then, the weight of the decision in front of me, the quiet understanding that whatever I chose now would be entirely mine. Not influenced. Not manipulated. Just mine. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. I let out a slow breath, the tension in my chest easing as I allowed myself to accept everything as it was. The pain, the past, the truth of who we had been and who we were now. Then, without overthinking it, without questioning it, I made my choice. I stepped closer. Not because I needed him, not because I had forgotten, but because I understood. And despite everything, despite the lies, the manipulation, the way he had shattered me before, I could see the truth that remained beneath it all. Some part of what we had shared had been real. And now, standing in front of him, whole in a way I had never been before, I chose him, not as the girl he had broken, but as the woman who had survived it. The end. This story was brought to you by Romance Novel. Thank you for watching.